Hi, this is Wendell, and welcome to this chapter planning video for the ICND1 books chapter called Routing Protocol Concepts and Configuration. As usual, this is just guidance. Anything that's in the chapter is fair game on the test, but let's take a look at this chapter and see how to concentrate your effort. First of all, this is a very important chapter, probably a little more important than average, and it's got three major sections. In the first section, during your first pass through the chapter, I'd say make sure you get the connected route concepts. You don't have to spend a lot of time there, though. Just do it short and sweet. It's a relatively obvious concept. And then for the static routes, you can read about it, but it's important to think of the static routes as a learning tool. And the reason is that we're going to get into RIP, and it's our first routing protocol. And RIP, of course, learns routes. Well, static routes are how you configure, you type in the details of what RIP is going to end up learning later in the chapter. So if you can understand what your options are in a static route and the kinds of things you can configure in a static route, then you understand more about what RIP's job is. So that's all in the first section. The second section is a theory section. I would say first pass through, read it, hit the highlights. If you don't quite get something, don't worry about it. Then in the third section, it gets to RIP configuration. Read through and understand, and I would concentrate on the network command and the fact that the network command requires a classful network as its parameter, a class A, B, or C network number. And that is probably the one thing that tends to throw people off. All throughout this first pass, I would keep my command notebook out if you've been working on that and add any new configuration or show commands in there as you go along. Next, during your second pass through the chapter, the review pass typically after you've just finished reading the chapter, I would say if you've got some lab time, maybe play around with the extended ping command that you found in the first section of this chapter. Also, if you look at the book study page for this chapter on my website, Search Skills, I should have a lab there by now that's an extra static route lab. It's not there when I first published this video, but it should be by the end of May in 2011. Then as you're doing your review of having read the chapter, for the second section, I'd just say glance at that big table at the end of the second section that compares routing protocols, and just make sure you get the highlights from there. And then when you're reviewing the RIP section, a nice exercise you can use is to predict the contents of the show IP protocols command. That tells you the status of RIP. So I'd say take the same triangle of routers you saw in the chapter, make up all new IP addresses, and make up the RIP config that you think would be there. And then say, all right, what am I going to expect to see in the output of show IP protocols on each of those three routers? And if you have some lab gear, you can go ahead and lab it up. Then when you get to the part review, which in this case comes after one more chapter on troubleshooting, I would say as you start to review, ask yourself these questions. What prevents a connected route from being added to the routing table? What prevents a static route from being added to the routing table? And what prevents RIP learned routes from being added to the routing table? Now, another way to think of that is what configuration or other things can happen that break those things. So that's a nice way to think about things for this chapter to review. Also, I would say with a blank piece of paper, without looking at your notes, write down all the configuration and show commands you learned in this whole part of the book. And then get out your command notebook that you've been building and compare that list. And make sure you remember all the commands and any parameters in there that you may have forgotten. Review those. Then at your final review, once you've read the whole book, let me give you some perspective on the connected routes, the static routes, and for RIP learned routes. If you have a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being most important, understanding connected routes is a 10. Understanding RIP routes is a 10. Static routes, maybe not as important. I'd maybe give it a 7. But the things in this particular chapter are very important. So if you feel uncomfortable with any of these topics, review, do some more labs, and make sure you've got this down before you go to take the test.